Hello, and thank you for joining me. Today is May the 1st. It will already be May the 2nd in many parts of the world, but it's May Day. So it feels like a good opportunity to discuss the very important issue of workers' rights around the world. This is something I feel very strongly about because I believe that workers' rights are a core aspect of human rights. This to me goes without saying. What I want to do is talk about a little bit of history, but more importantly, the situation in the world today. Um, and I'm going to be talking about my own country, but also some of the situation as I see it around the world. Um, I am approaching this from someone who doesn't see himself as a socialist. And I don't think that is necessarily a contradiction. I don't think it's a bit like you don't have to call yourself a feminist to believe in women's rights. So, by the same principle, you don't have to call yourself a socialist to believe in basic workers' rights. And this is something that I think is so critical because there is a very real problem all over the world of exploitation and of people being treated very unfairly and simply not being able to have a voice. Now, this is truly a universal problem. In developed countries such as the UK, there has been great strides made, and this must be acknowledged. People shouldn't take this for granted and shouldn't overlook this. And it's because of the struggles of generations in the past, some of whom ended up as legislators, people like Keir Hardie. It is because of the tireless efforts of those people that we have some of the basic understanding of labour rights today. You know, 200 years ago, at the time when being part of a union and organised labour was illegal, then I really think we take for granted just how hard life sometimes was. But unfortunately, it's not a situation today that everything is perfect. We still see sometimes inexcusable situations, like what happened at Sports Direct last year. Sports Direct is a big multinational sports retailer. They sell sports equipment. Well, they got involved in a huge scandal, arguably not as big as it should have been, but basically the conditions in warehouses across the UK were so bad that in one situation a pregnant woman was forced to deliver her baby in a toilet cubicle. In a toilet cubicle. The CEO, Mike Ashley, appeared before a parliamentary committee. His excuse was that the company had outgrown him. I didn't think he was sincere at all. He claimed he was sorry, but I think his whole attitude was self pity. And I'm not saying that to be populist, to sort of bash the rich, because I don't actually think that there is an inherent contradiction between saying, on one hand, that you absolutely believe in the need for workers' rights, whilst also acknowledging that having positive productivity helps business and helps entrepreneurialism and helps enterprise. Now, to me, this needn't be a contradiction. I reject the idea that to be pro workers' rights, you have to constantly bash the rich and think that all, CEOs who have done well are evil people who exploit the workers. That is not the case. Um, and likewise, if you're, really capitalist minded, if you're really pro business, you shouldn't underplay the importance of workers' rights. So that's why I very much believe in the third way as a concept. If we look at history, both capitalism and far left, communism has a lot to answer for in terms of the way it treats people. Now, communism is rightly viewed as the more totalitarian ideology because with capitalism, it's not totalitarian in the same sense, but that doesn't mean it's flawless. In communist systems, people were literally worked to death. And ironically, You know, conservatives in Western countries often speak out against the power of trade unions. Ironically, in communist states, they were even more hardline on trade unions. Um, in China, in the Soviet Union, um, China under Mao, I should say, um, and in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge literally worked people to death. So every totalitarian regime used work as a weapon. It was used against the Jews at Auschwitz. It was used against Stalinist dissidents from the Stalinist era. It was used in Maoist China, and it was used in Khmer Rouge era Cambodia. Um, but capitalism has a lot to answer for as well. If we look at one of the most egregious examples, the Belgian Congo under King Leopold II, some estimates as many as 8 million Congolese were worked to death. And even if you want to get closer to home, if you look at the factory conditions in Victorian Britain, some were better than others. Some had more compassionate owners. But that's the point. It came down to the discretion of those individual mill owners. And some of them were tyrants. Others were more humane. They provided housing and accommodation for the workers. They did care about workers' rights. Um, but there were others who were basically tyrants. They did not care. Their only focus was on profit. I recently watched a documentary about Andrew Carnegie. One of the most infamous things that happened during his rise to power and prominence was the famous, I believe it was called the Jonestown Strike of 1886. I need to patch up on my history there. But basically, there was a major strike, and this came about from appalling conditions. Now, Carnegie claimed ignorance. He claimed that whilst he had been away, his subordinate had taken running of the situation and allowed it to get that bad. But the point is, it really got out of hand and it ended up in bloodshed. The United States has a very long history of often bloody labour relations. Now, my understanding of it, and I have to emphasise this is quite a basic understanding, is that there was fault on both sides. I mean, at the end of the First World War, there was examples of far left um, factions actually attacking veterans as they made parades down the street. But there were also examples of bloody battles with workers who were only asking for basic rights. So America's a very complex and long history with this. So does Britain. In Britain, we had Toll Puddle Martyrs in Dorset, arguably the world's first trade union, way back, I believe it was about 1812. Um, so the history of this is very important because it's easy to condemn Marx and Engels, but whilst I hate communism, I do understand why it started. I do understand why they were writing the way that they did. And the fact that they came from middle class backgrounds really is not that relevant. What matters is what they were saying. And I believe that Marx was right insofar as there was exploitation going on in the industrial world. And he particularly looked at Britain because we were, of course, the world's first industrialized nation. So I hate communism because of its intolerance, because of its cruelty, because of the massive human rights abuses that take place under communism. But I'm not against the original communist idea of workers' rights. That got lost down the line. But, and by the way, I'm not saying, communist regimes are not really communist. They are communist, de facto communist. So, I'm not one of the people that say that. But the importance of labour rights is really profound. If we look in the situation in the world today, every country is different. And so realistically, I don't expect every country to be on exactly the same level. But there is a false argument in this that in many countries that are developing, a big argument is, oh, we'll focus on economic growth first. That's the most important thing. Then everything else, we'll deal with that later on. Human rights, labour rights. And they dismiss these things, the governments often dismiss these things as being secondary, as being unimportant. What I would argue is that there is no reason why these things cannot be done in tandem. Yes, economic growth is very important, and we have to be fair in our analysis here. So, for example, in China, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. That can only be welcomed. But there is enormous exploitation taking place in China. And there's exploitation taking place in Bangladesh and Pakistan, and many developing countries. One only has to go back 4 years. The horrendous disaster at the Savar factory, I believe, just outside Dhaka. Over 1,000 people killed. That was the worst industrial accident, non-nuclear industrial accident in history. And there have been many in history. That one was the worst. Bangladesh is no stranger to disasters, nor is Pakistan. A few years ago in Pakistan, over 250 people were killed in fires in factories. And this happens somewhere in the world every year, sometimes several times a year. And the situation then gets highlighted because of these big disasters. But there is also situations going on all the time that don't necessarily get a lot of coverage. We don't see these on the news all the time. We don't see these situations. They're not really in the everyday conversation. Um, and yet, the sort of exploitation we're seeing in the world today is because of the bigger world population, is arguably more widespread than it has been even in the Victorian period. Because if you look, for example, at child miners in the Congo, or you look at people working in sweatshop conditions now, in developed countries, we often think the consumer has a moral responsibility. So, for example, if you buy from Primark, uh, it's up to Primark shoppers to put pressure on the CEO of Primark to then put pressure on his or her counterparts in Bangladesh or Pakistan to make sure that the working conditions are humane. Now, to be fair, I don't believe that the CEO of Primark wakes up and says, "Oh, how many Bangladeshi children can I work to death today?" I don't believe it's that simple. But I do believe they have an absolute responsibility to insist that basic rights are upheld. And if those rights are not upheld, threaten to pull out business from a country. Because the top CEOs often in these countries, um, because frankly, the way corruption works, they often are closely linked to the politics of the country. So that is very important. And if anyone thinks I'm just bashing developing countries, I'm not. There are good people in developing countries. There are people who are trying to improve the situation. And I don't want to sound condescending, by the way. I don't want to sound like I'm talking down to developed countries. Because, like I say, we are very far from perfect. I mean, what happened in Sports Direct was disgusting. And I don't believe it is unique. I don't believe it is unique. There's been similar claims from Amazon. And having worked in the catering industry and restaurants as a waiter, I believe that the catering industry in particular is rife with abuse. You know, in the UK, trade unions are legal. We have a minimum wage. All these things had to be fought for. But the situation is still not perfect. If someone feels that they're being exploited today, it's not that easy to have a voice to raise issue out of it, as that Sports Direct situation showed, where the employees were frightened to complain. That's unacceptable. So I'm going to round this up, but there's a few things I want to close with. Firstly, I recognise that this is a gradual process. Things don't happen overnight. And I don't expect every country, especially countries with big populations, to have an absolutely perfect labour rights record. It does take time, it is complex, but it is a priority because without that basic respect for human rights, the thing is, it isn't just this kind of vague notion of human rights for the sake of it. It's actually practical and it helps everyone. Why? Because if employees are happy, they're likely to be more productive. This is common sense. if I'm a CEO of a company, even if I'm a manager of a small or medium-sized company, I would really want to ensure that my staff are happy. That doesn't mean I wouldn't have expectations from them. It wouldn't mean that I would, not expect them to be reliable and so on, and have authority. But I would want to make sure that they were content, that they didn't feel that they were being treated unfairly, and if they did honestly feel they were being treated unfairly, I would want to talk to them directly and say, okay, let's talk about this. What is the issue? And let's talk this through, and I'll see how I can maybe improve things. Um, that's very important. That is good business. So I totally reject the idea that if you're pro labour rights, that somehow makes you some sort of flag carrying, rich hating communist. Not at all. I don't hate rich people. I do hate exploitation, and I do have utter contempt for rich people who get rich off the backs of exploitation. But I think it's a mistake that some on the hard left make, is in assuming that all rich people are inherently bad and they have built up their business by being bastards and being completely selfish. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's fair. Some of the most successful companies in the world are ethical companies. They have a big emphasis on that. So I'm going to close up just by saying, back to the situation in the UK. Well, on the world situation, certainly there are some things that should not be happening. Take, for instance, child minors in Congo. Now, Congo is essentially a failed state, racked by war for years. I appreciate that it isn't something that is going to change overnight, but it's wrong. And at the very least, the government there should be trying to do something about it. International pressure should be put on the government to do something about it. But when we talk about labour rights, it's essential that developed countries don't get charged with hypocrisy. Therefore, they themselves need to look in the mirror and think, are we doing everything we can to ensure that people are not being exploited? I believe there is a long way to go even in Britain. Because as it stands, we have a minimum wage, which was hard fought by, which the Tories opposed, incidentally. And we have trade unions and so forth. But it isn't that easy if someone feels they're being treated unfairly to have an avenue to complain. It's not. Because they often fear that they will be fired if they raise concerns. That's unacceptable. I believe that employers, managers who knowingly treat their workers like dirt are no better than criminals. So if an employer refuses to pay their staff on time, if they're not paying them the full amount that they are meant to be paid, as far as I'm concerned, they're no better than a common thief. And I really do believe such companies should be shamed. They should be held up and really, really scrutinised. Now, I'll just say a quick word on the general election here. Jeremy Corbyn has come under an enormous amount of pressure and criticism from the Murdoch right-wing press. I am not a Jeremy Corbyn supporter because there are areas I cannot align myself with his thinking. For example, his stance on terrorism, among a number of other very important areas. But one thing I will not criticise Jeremy Corbyn for is for saying what needs to be said about the importance of basic workers' rights. I will say this about Blairite or centrist Labour MPs, and Maajid Nawaz made this point. In a democracy, you have to have a left-right spectrum. Now, those centrist MPs who I politically am probably more aligned with are always attacking Jeremy Corbyn for being left-wing. Well, Labour might well lose badly in this election, but in a democracy, you need a left-wing voice, like really socialist left-wing voice. And I will say that Jeremy Corbyn and others in that faction, in my opinion, they do deserve credit for speaking out on these things when no other leaders will. Now, I don't agree with Jeremy Corbyn on a wide range of issues, but I am grateful to him and for some of those around him for at least giving the voice to people who don't have a voice. So we can say Labour's unelectable, we can say There's certain hard left positions that are a bit extreme. But there are other areas, frankly, are not that extreme, are very reasonable. And if all Theresa May and the Tories can do is throw out schoolboy insults, that really says a lot. So I would be a hypocrite if I was to outright attack Jeremy Corbyn. You know, when I criticise the left, if I outright attack Jeremy Corbyn, I have been exploited in the workplace. I know what that feels like. So I'm not going to attack a man on those grounds. There's other areas I disagree with Jeremy Corbyn. There's areas I have felt very uneasy about some of his positions. But when it comes to basic socialist principles insofar as labour rights are concerned, I'm not going to attack Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn and those around him have shown compassion when it comes to the awful way that welfare recipients are being treated right now. They've shown compassion in terms of the most vulnerable in society. And this is something I don't think we should underplay. They probably will lose the election, but I am grateful that they have spoken out. And I don't want a situation where we only have right-wing and centrist parties. Even if I disagree with the hard left, it is important that there is that balance, that counter-narrative. And I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts. Please feel free to subscribe, and thank you for watching. This has been a long video, but I feel there was a lot to discuss. Thank you.